Welcome into the midweek mailbag show presented to you by Fantasy Points. My name is Nick Skrip, and on the show every week I take questions from the community and answer them here. Most of the time it's from our Fantasy Points subscriber Discord, which all of these questions today comes from. Incentive there to sign up for Fantasy Points, not just to get your questions answered on this show, but we do have daily interactions between the Fantasy Points staff members and the subscribers in that Discord chat. So this week we have some good questions, and for most leagues, Week 15 means the fantasy football playoffs. So pretty much do or die for most leagues. So getting some of these questions answered is going to be important. First one, again, all from our Fantasy Points subscriber Discord, is from Maniac Trades. He asks, Travis Etienne, bench him, ? So looking at his last few games, Etienne, Week 12, he got banged up. He only played 8% of the snaps that game. He left the game early. Week 13, he played most of the game at 88% of the snaps. Had 16 touches, but was unproductive with them for the fantasy world. Week 14, again, he played the majority of the snaps at 75%. 17 touches, unproductive again. I will say in his defense that the Lions allow the 25th most points per game to running backs, and the Titans allow the 27th most. So when we look at points per game for the fantasy world allowed to running backs, these are two tougher defenses, especially across the last couple of weeks. Still, he scored under 7 fantasy points. That stings. So we can say the matchups were rough, but at the same point, it didn't help you for your weeks. Dallas is the next opponent and is, again, a rough matchup. They are 29th in fantasy points allowed per game. So they are worse of a matchup than the 2 games that he just had duds in. So this always comes down, to how your roster looks. What sort of depth do you have? For redraft, not a lot of teams are super, super deep at running back unless you struck gold later in your draft and use the waiver wire to a high extent. But if you had the depth to maybe sit Etienne, I don't blame you, just because of his production the last 2 weeks, and also due to the matchup that we have against Dallas. And matchups are very important when it comes to the fantasy playoffs. On the other hand, though, if you have to get cute and use somebody that you're totally swinging for the fences with, then I might just stay put. So it's very situational. I will say there's 2 good signs the last 2 games, despite him not doing well for fantasy. Number one, his snap percentage has stayed very high. We see plenty of running back rooms that the lead back is just over 50%, or maybe he's in the 60% range. So having 88% and 75% of the snaps the last 2 games, it's still a good sign. He's not sharing work. Number 2, he's still getting a decent amount of touches, at least 16 the last 2 games, 17 this past week. Two signs that, hey, you know what? He's on the field a lot. He's getting the work. We've seen better days out of him. He's a guy that scored 17 plus fantasy points in all of weeks 7 through 9. And those weren't cake matchups. So situational, I get it for sure. Looking at the matchup here, looking at what he's done the last 2 games. But again, he's a guy on the field a lot. He's a guy getting touches. So you have to just weigh it out for who you actually have, I guess. Next question here, Skylar Bean 13. First round of playoffs. My running backs are Jacobs, Connor, and Kamara. Wide receivers are Chase, Hopkins, and Metcalf. Would you start Jacobs and Connor, bench Hopkins, and flex Kamara? So this is interesting. So very specific to this team, but maybe some of these players we touch on apply to other people here. Jacobs, the overall PPR running back 2 overall. Right now, averaging 21.8 fantasy points. Number 1 in rushing yards on the season. Over 40 catches, double-digit touchdowns. I think you ride this guy despite whatever the matchup is, just because he's been so good this season. Fairly consistent on a week-to-week basis. He's had great weeks. Workhorse running back. You ride Jacobs into the sunset. What was impressive about James Conner this past week is he faced one of the hardest running back fantasy matchups and still walked away with 23.4 fantasy points against the Patriots. 6 catches is to note here because there was a quarterback change. 20 plus fantasy points in 3 out of 4 of his last games. Over 20 touches in 3 of those games as well. So we have a guy scoring very well for fantasy, producing against good defenses, and has been consistent the last couple of weeks. So to me, even with the quarterback situation, Kyler Murray unfortunately tore his ACL. I'm sticking with James Conner, I think, right now. He's too hot not to. Now comes the difficult part. So Alvin Kamara has not scored 13 fantasy points since week 8. That specific week, he went wild for 42.8. So the fact that we're saying this just doesn't make a ton of sense, right? Especially if you roster him. 5 straight after that 40-plus point performance, really bad fantasy weeks for Alvin Kamara. Back-to-back weeks around 5 fantasy points, and his touches have not been great. He faces Atlanta, though, coming up following the bye now, who ranks 13th overall in fantasy points per game allowed to running backs. The hope that you would have for Kamara is that the matchup plus that bye week will serve him good. Maybe get him back on track for the fantasy playoffs. DeAndre Hopkins is coming off of his lowest fantasy outing since returning to action in week 7 with 11.9 fantasy points. He did have 11 targets in this game, and he's had 11-plus targets in 5 out of 7 of his games played, and at least 18 fantasy points in, again, 5 out of 7 games played. He does face one of the toughest matchups for the wide receiver position in the fantasy world against Denver. They allow the second least fantasy points per game on the year. Kyler Murray tore his ACL, like we just mentioned, so they're going to be rolling with Colt McCoy. So tougher matchup now with the backup quarterback. So the risk here is benching a guy who has been absorbing a ton of targets and balling out just because of the matchup and because of the backup quarterback. So both Kamara and D-Hop present risks. Maybe, you juggle here which Cardinal you want to start between James Conner and Hopkins. But again, I really like what Conner's been doing. He's involved in the passing game. He's a guy that always is a touchdown threat, and he's hot for the fantasy world right now. I actually might roll with Kamara in this situation. It's a decent matchup. Hopefully the bye week did him some justice. I don't know if he was 100% healthy or not. Ingram is on the IR, Mark Ingram, so that takes him out of the mix. So it's strange to say bench DeAndre Hopkins, but also it's a terrible matchup with the backup quarterback. So I'm going to lean with D-Hop being the odd man out. We'll have to reflect on this one following week 15. Next one, Lord_Teets. Is Dobbins trustworthy enough to start? So the first game back was solid for JK, and you love to see that since it's been a frustrating year, not just for the fantasy aspect of it, but also just for him in general. He's voiced that. In this past week, 15 attempts for 120 rushing yards and a touchdown on 43% of the snaps, 18 fantasy points. Great. It's a great start. He was quoted saying, "It's still not me all the way yet. And I'm going to continue to get better, and hopefully those 100-yard games will start turning into 200-yard games. Maybe." Despite the clip of him looking like he was running in some sort of a limp, the big breakaway run, it's encouraging to see him have the second most rushing yards in a single game for his NFL career in that first game back since he's missed some time. Gus Edwards still factored in, seeing just 2 less carries, but I do like Dobbins this week. Cleveland allows the third most fantasy points per game to running backs. We also have a chance, and we're not sure yet, we have a chance that the Ravens are on their third string quarterback pending Tyler Huntley's status for this week. So I expect Dobbins to see a decent workload heading into week 15 in a decent matchup. Next, at CMartin18, is Gabe Davis still in play as a wide receiver 3/flex? We know Gabriel Davis is a big play waiting to happen. He gets looked at deep. He's had 2 weeks over 21 fantasy points this season. His usage is very inconsistent, though. 7 weeks of 6+ targets, 5 weeks of 5 or less targets, just 4 this past game. He's also had 7 games under 10 fantasy points, to 5 games over 10 fantasy points. That is not great. That's not good. Dolphins, who they play, they're middle of the table in terms of a fantasy matchup for wide receivers. But for Buffalo, it just feels like outside of Stephon Diggs, it's someone new every other week having a good day. In week 14, it was Dawson Knox. In week 13, it was James Cook. In week 12, it was Isaiah McKenzie. I'm not a fan, honestly, in Gabriel Davis for being comfortable putting him in your lineup. If you need to swing for the fences and have this big upside play, maybe then you throw that dart and hope for some good usage and for him to have a decent fantasy week. If you need something more stable and consistent, I would pivot this week. In all honesty, just again, 7 games under 10 fantasy points, 5 games over it. It's risk reward, I guess, but the usage is not consistent. Last question at Anthony FF. Give us one week 15 sleeper play. All right, so I'm going to go with one of my preseason, my guys, Jahan Dotson, the rookie wide receiver for the Commanders. The bye week happens too often in the fantasy when playing fantasy, and we forget what guys do before that, because when a guy's on a bye, you are focusing on everybody but that specific guy or that specific team. And too much goes on for everybody to always remember everything. But after returning week 10 from injury, Dotson's usage was bad. Wasn't getting targeted. His snaps weren't where they were to open up the season. Then week 13 rolls around, and he catches 5 of his 9 targets for 54 yards and scored his 5th touchdown of the season, 16.4 fantasy points. Dotson opened up the season with back-to-back weeks over 17 fantasy points. In his first 4 NFL games, he also totaled 4 touchdowns. People forget that this was a first-round draft investment by the Commanders. He was one of my favorite prospects in the class, and I felt he was being slept on in rookie drafts based on his profile. Dotson faces the Giants this week in week 15, who he just had that 9-target game before the bye against. So the Commanders went Giants by Giants. He just had a good game against the Giants. It's a conference matchup. Both of these teams have identical records. This game means a lot. And I think that, and it could be wrong, but I think that, again, their first-round investment, seeing him have 9 targets last game, maybe he's fully healthy now, seeing what he did to open up the season, I think that he's going to be a good part of this game plan for week 15. And we see too often rookies have, a second year change in their fantasy stocks, right? Rookie wide receivers often trend up the second half of the season. And, we've seen it last year and we've seen it pretty consistently. And I feel like Dotson can fit in this trend, especially come the fantasy playoffs. So this week will be important because they had the bye. We're not sure if that 9 targets, is that going to be sticky? But I think it could be. I think that the talent is there. I think that, again, they invested in this guy and he's a big part of their future. Jahan Dotson, week 15 sleeper. All right, guys. So again, fantasy playoffs is this week for most leagues. Good luck. Hopefully you guys take home some dubs, got something from this episode, and good luck the rest of the way. We're in it to win some ships.